Welcome in to the best in true crime podcasting. This is True Crime Tuesday. I'm Tim Dennis. Got a great show for you coming up here in this hour and a half. I tell you, I read a very interesting book, and I'm excited to share it with everybody. It's called Dead in the Water, a true story of hijacking, murder, and global maritime conspiracy. I'm excited to bring our guests in because it's one of those crimes that, not just the murder part of it, but hijacking on the high seas is one of those ones that, besides the piracy part of it, which we'll talk about because there is a Somali connection to it. And I do want to talk about the Somali connection having to do with our own little hometown here in Minneapolis. And there's an interesting mention of it in the book, the city of Minneapolis. And I do want to talk to the authors about that. But I think there's a little bit of a thing that caught me a little off guard, in that I assumed that, I guess, other than the piracy that you saw in, I believe it was Captain Phillips, the Tom Hanks movie, you would think that, piracy must be few and far between in today's world. You would think that there's many policing agencies out there on the high seas, and that this would be a very rare happening out there, but it's not. We'll get to that here in just a second. Let's introduce our guest, shall we? Matthew Campbell is an award-winning reporter and editor for Bloomberg Businessweek magazine, covering major political and business stories across the Asia-Pacific region. He has reported from more than 20 countries on subjects including crime, terrorism, climate change, and public health. Also, Kit Chellel is a reporter at Bloomberg and a writer for Bloomberg Businessweek magazine. He has won numerous international prizes for his work, covering everything from Chinese state hackers and feuding hedge funds to shady Nigerian oil deals and Irish sectarian gangsters. I think it's safe to say, guys, you haven't covered a lost puppy in probably, 25, 30, 40 years, something to that effect. Let's welcome in both Matthew and Kit to the show. How you doing today, guys?
Great, thank you.
Thanks so much.
I should just say, I did once cover a lost turtle.
Really?
It was many years ago. It was about 25 years ago when I was a local newspaper man.
So now you've opened it up, Kit. The lost turtle. What was the end game to the lost turtle, and how did that come up?
To cut a very long and mundane story short, it just walked off. But in a local newspaper, you'll take any news you can get.
Did they recover said turtle? I mean, it couldn't have gone far, really.
Well, they never found it.
It's still out there somewhere looking for its owner.
Yeah,
it's just
anyone from Tunbridge in England listening. If you see a turtle walking in the street, give me a call.
I wonder if it had a little leash just dragging behind it. Let's start off this covering Dead in the Water with exactly what I was talking about to kind of tease the program, and that's this. Just the stigma that, we have plenty of organizations out there that should be staving this off, right? I mean, you've got Coast Guards, you've got maritime police, you've got international organizations such as the CIA and others that should be out there, right, keeping the seas at peace. And you would think that the Navy, you've got plenty out there that, should be able to take these kind of rinky-dink pirate organizations and blow them right out of the water. Wouldn't you think so? Let's get in the I see Kit smiling. Let's start with Matthew. Isn't that the idea? We should be able to sleep safe, because why not? I mean, it's just a couple of pirates after all, right, Matthew?
Well, piracy is an interesting phenomenon. It really does come and go in both time and space. So in the period we write about at the beginning of this book, 2010, 2011, the Gulf of Aden, Horn of Africa, the waterways going into the Red Sea and the Suez Canal, that was the global hub of piracy. There were attacks every couple of days, or at least attempted attacks. There were lots of successful hijackings. In the years since, piracy in that region has largely come to a stop. And that's a result of really quite concerted efforts by the U.S. Navy, European navies, and police and military forces from around the world. That said, this is kind of like a balloon. When you press on one part of it, it pops up somewhere else. So there is persistent piracy in the Gulf of Guinea, West Africa, in the Strait of Malacca, very close to where I'm sitting here in Singapore. There is piracy on and off. So that kind of bandit level lawlessness is always a reality in the shipping industry. But what Kit and I are really interested in is the much higher level lawlessness, the really elaborate conspiracies and chicanery of various kinds that happen in the kind of big money boardrooms that make the shipping world go around. And that's really what the book is about.
And Kit, there's something very interesting in the book, and one of the things that I found intriguing in that there's a Somali connection that's mentioned in the book. Now, what I wanted to mention to both of you, and Kit, I'll address this to you. There's a mention when you first mentioned pirates in this book, and again, the remind me of the name of the ship that we're dealing with here.
It's the Brilliante Virtuoso.
Right. You talk about the possibility of Somali pirates attacking this ship, and you mentioned that when pirates attack a ship, they need to take, if they do capture the crew of the ship, they generally try to take the crew and ransom the crew to the owner of the ship, and a lot of times they'll get a payoff. And then they try to legitimize that money somehow. They try to take and run that money through somewhere and try to launder it, for lack of a better term, correct?
That's right. Yeah, I mean, the thing to know about modern piracy is, we're not talking about people coming on board ships to steal loot. They're not interested in your cash or whatever treasures you might have on board. The reality is that these days, a large commercial vessel, whether it's an oil tanker or a container ship, might be worth, including its cargo, anything from $100 million up to over $1 billion. So these are like floating towns. They can be packed full of electronics or crude oil, and they're enormously valuable, and there'll be financial interests from all over the world invested in every single one of these ships that are out at sea right now. And so the money making from modern piracy comes from boarding and taking control of that vessel. They'll use grappling hooks or some other means to get aboard. They menace the crew with weaponry, and then they take them to Somalia, and they say, you can't have your vessel back or your crew back alive until you pay us however many millions of dollars in a ransom. And there are people whose job it is to go and negotiate with pirates and make sure these payments are made so they can free these vessels up. I spoke to a guy who was in charge of making the payments to free ships that have been seized, and he would sometimes literally take an aeroplane and fly over and drop suitcases of money into a particular zone to pay off these guys. The reality is, when you've got $1 billion cargo and 20 poor terrified guys with families, sometimes there's very little choice but to pay up. Now, the thing that you raised about Minnesota goes to the bigger problem of maritime crime, which is how international it really is and why it persists. Even the quite localized problem of Somali piracy, these are international criminal gangs, and when they get money, they have to launder it so they can use it. And that can be quite a sophisticated process. It'll go through local business people, it'll filter its way into the financial system, and then it'll spread out through bank accounts and wire transfers around the world and come back clean to the people who profit from it. So in this case, one of our investigators that we write about in the book was dealing with a case of Somali piracy, and he managed to intercept the communications coming to and from the vessel. So the pirates were communicating with their conspirators, and he traced one of the calls to, I think, the Midlands in England, and another one to Minnesota. Mm-hmm. Presumably, there are sort of members of the Somali expat community there who help in this game of spreading money around so they can clean it and keep it out of the police's hands.
And what's interesting when that's brought up in the book, it's not the first thing that's ever been run through Minnesota. Right now, there's a current scandal having to do with, I believe it's a food drive that's being run through money laundering through banks. And I happen to have a friend who's in the banking community that's having to sort through document upon document upon document right now, trying to untangle all this. And this food drive being used as a front to send money back to Somalia. There was a daycare that did a daycare ring that was doing a similar thing as well. There are legitimate fronts that are run, and it's not just oil and piracy. It's also things like running cat, and cat is mentioned in the book as well. Which, if listeners aren't familiar, it's kind of the a cross between like chewing tobacco, which gives you the high of like kind of like a low grade of cocaine, it kind of, or caffeine. It gives you kind of that type of rush or high, which you chew on it, and it gives you that kind of rush. And a lot of cat is run through Minnesota as well. So there's that in which our police forces and the DEA try to stop that running of that substance as well through here. So there is that ring that runs through Minneapolis, which is a lot larger than people know.
I think this is a global problem, genuinely. I mean, there's a huge amount of dirty money in the world. No one really knows how big the black economy is, but it's enormous. And all that dirty money has to go somewhere. And these days, most reputable banks will have checks and controls to stop it just being deposited by suitcase, in a Texan bank branch. The criminals have to work a little harder to clean it. And there's all sorts of ways they do it. And sometimes it can be legitimate businesses. Because I'm a cynical-minded person and because I've spent years covering this stuff, whenever I walk around London and I see a large empty restaurant on a prime bit of real estate with no customers, my first thought is, well, what's that a front for?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, obviously that's the first thing you would think. I mean, being a reporter of that sort. Matthew, tell us a little bit about, and Kit, I'll follow up with you as well with this. This case is an unusual case, but tell me what kind of tickled your fancy about why turn this into a book? Why this case in particular? Why would you want to expound on it and yet turn it into a book to warn people, or more than just warn people, but what is it about this case of this ship and this murder and this hijacking that it became fascinating enough to turn it into a book?
Well, there are a few reasons that we found this story so compelling and worth spending the years of reporting and writing that we have devoted to it. One was, as you alluded to, there was this unsolved murder, this murder that is still unsolved. David Mockett, a British marine surveyor working for Lloyd's of London, the world's most important insurance market, who was killed in Yemen in 2011 in very murky circumstances. His killers remain at large, wherever they may be. So that, of course, was tantalizing. Something else that really piqued our interest, I think, was the chance to delve into the world of shipping, which is a part of the world economy, an incredibly important part of the world economy that I feel like I know nothing about or knew nothing about before this. I think I know a fair bit about it now. But as you know, there's a phrase about shipping that ships are responsible for 90% of everything. Mm-hmm. That 90% of all the goods that come into your home or your office, or importantly, go into the tank of your car, because of course oil is a big part of the shipping business, come on ships. And yet we know almost nothing about the shipping industry. We know almost nothing about the people who serve and work on ships in very difficult conditions. And we know almost nothing about all the ways in which this industry operates totally out of public view, largely unregulated, and provides lots of opportunities for fraud and other kinds of wrongdoing that really go unnoticed and unpoliced. So this book, for Kit and I, two investigative journalists who like delving into hidden worlds, for lack of a better term, this story had a lot of ingredients that really made sense for us to spend a lot of time on. And I think the result is a window into this hidden world that should be fascinating, certainly fascinating to us.
Before we jump into the story, let me ask both of you, and let me start with Kit. What you researched for Dead in the Water, a true story of hijacking, murder, and a global maritime conspiracy, does it give you a little bit of insight as to, not just in this time of inflation where gas prices are incredibly high, where the price of oil is getting up there, did it give you a little bit of insight as to why the price of oil does what it does, why the price of gasoline is doing what it does? Kit, did it give you a little insight as to how it goes from the field to the processing to the pump? Did it give you a little more of an understanding?
I think so. I think it, when you understand how physically connected we all are still, despite it's the digital age we live in, everyone uses their computers. We like to think of ourselves as different from people who lived before us because we can use our phones to call someone on the other side of the world. But that phone will have been built and assembled, in Asia and sent here by ship. You still have to physically move things around. And even in the technologically advanced age that we live in, we are still relying on, very large man-made vessels to get things around the globe. And shipping is definitely a lot safer than it used to be. But it's still a very uncertain business. You only have to look at what happened in the Suez Canal. When the Ever Given got stuck there and the chaos that caused all around the world, one ship getting side on in the Suez Canal, that caused however many hundreds of millions of dollars worth of damage. That one shot can disrupt this whole system. So when you see how it works and you understand it better and you realize, it doesn't take much to knock it out of kilter. Take it like a war. If there's a war happening anywhere in the world, whenever there's a war happening, ships go down. Ships are hit by missiles. Ships are attacked. Wars tend to attract criminal activity like piracy and fraud. And that has a huge impact on the shipping business. And it can raise the prices for everything from gasoline to, basic consumer goods that we all rely on.
Mm-hmm. Matthew, do you have a better understanding now of just how this wacky economy is going up and down based on your research for this book?
I do. There is as Kit alluded to, there is a physical reality to the global economy that you do gain a better appreciation for when you start learning about shipping. That in the case of the Ever Given, all of these trillions of dollars worth of trade flows and all the secondary markets built on top of those financial flows really came down to the width and depth of one trench through the desert in Egypt. And so I think when you begin to think about that and to realize that these consumer comforts that we've all come to expect are just going to be there, they do have to physically get to us, and someone has to do that. There are machines and people who have to make that happen. And actually, we have a line in the book about how invisible shipping has become to a lot of people. Time was maybe 100 years ago or even 50 years ago. If you lived in a big city in Europe or North America, you might know sailors or people who had been sailors. You might work near an active port. You might have relatives who were connected to the shipping business in some way. It was much more viscerally felt. But actually, what has happened over the last few decades is a few things. First of all, the sailors all come from places like the Philippines now, developing countries where men, seafarers, can be hired very, very cheaply to work long hours in difficult conditions. Ships have gotten a lot bigger, so the old vessels could come into Lower Manhattan. Was one of the great ports of the world. Ships could come right into New York City. Modern container vessels are much too large for that, of course. So the ports move out, and thus we don't get up close and personal with them in the same way. And the other trend that is harder to measure and more insidious in some ways is that the financial and legal structure of the shipping industry has also become invisible. It's moved into offshore financial centers, into shell companies, into structures designed to pay as little tax and be subject to as little regulation as possible. So in both the physical and the more ethereal sense, shipping has gone from being very central and very visible to being very hard to get your arms around, even as it's become more important to everything in tandem with the explosion in global trade. So I think it's a really fascinating combination of themes, and it's been a remarkable experience, certainly for me, and I think also for Kit, to learn so much more about how this hidden world operates.
One of the things that fascinated me too, and kind of shocked me, Matthew, and if you'll expound on this, is the way that Lloyd's of London has changed throughout time, throughout the way it started to the time that it has become now, and the way that they pay out. And that has a lot to do with this mystery, and exactly why it pays to try to hijack these ships and try to sabotage a ship to try to make some money. It is very profitable to try and hijack a ship, isn't it?
So the central institution that we write about in Dead in the Water is Lloyd's of London, which a lot of people think is an insurer. It's not. It has never sold insurance, in fact. But Lloyd's is a market. So it is a venue, a physical venue, actually, in the financial district of London, where insurance companies and people who need insurance come to do business. So in theory, we'll cover just about anything that has a value that could be diminished by some unexpected event. So quite famously, Lloyd's does celebrity policies where Bruce Springsteen supposedly has a policy at Lloyd's insuring his voice. So if he ever loses his voice, Lloyd's pays out, and so on. However, the real center of Lloyd's, the bread and butter, is and has always been shipping and maritime trade. And that goes right back to Lloyd's founding more than 300 years ago as a coffee house, as they were then known in London, which were very fun places where businessmen would hang out and swap gossip, make deals, do a bit of trading. Much of the early trading at Lloyd's that Lloyd's was involved in had connections to the slave trade, which is something for which the modern Lloyd's institution has apologized. But Lloyd's Coffee House, as it was then, was a place where entrepreneurs, businessmen in the shipping industry tended to hang out. And over time, it evolved into this very modern financial market, which is now housed in a gigantic skyscraper, and without which the whole shipping business would grind to a halt, because shipping is a dangerous industry. All kinds of things can happen at sea, and no ship owner will ever set sail without insurance. And that's where Lloyd's comes in.
It was fascinating to learn that, I think, because as you mentioned, most of, I think, your readers, our listeners, assume that we hear about these huge, as you mentioned, the insurance policies, and we think that they just go around insuring willy-nilly these things that nobody else would take on, and that's far from the truth. And there are different groups that take on these risks. But the risks have huge rewards. And it seems like all around these rewards are, as I guess I reach for a hard explanation for this, the rewards are much more than what people realize. There's a reason why Lloyd's makes a lot of money. And they do make a lot of money. And there's a lot of money being thrown around into the billions, if not trillions of dollars on a yearly basis. There's a lot of money in oil. And I don't think people realize that. When you read this book, you realize the scope, really, of just what one tanker of oil is carrying across the sea to its destination. And we can't wrap our head around it because we hear, I think on a daily basis on the news, we hear, what is it up to now? $100 and some a barrel. So when you set down $100 and some a barrel, I can't wrap my head around how much is in a ship. But you break it down to how much for a payload in the ship that was, how much was on the Brilliante Virtuoso? Do you remember? Or Kit, how much was it?
It was 1 million barrels.
1 million barrels.
Yeah, that's how big these ships are. They're enormous.
Okay, so you're talking the payload of around $100 million?
Yeah.
Just for one ship?
That's just one ship. Now, if you imagine that you are the trader who has purchased that oil from a seller in Ukraine, and you're going to buy that oil and you're going to try and sell it somewhere else for more money. So you need to, in this case, they wanted to send the oil to China so it could be sold in China. Now, if you're an oil trader, that one single investment could be potentially ruinous for you. No one can afford to lose $100 million just because a typhoon blows in, or the captain is careless or drunk and scrapes a big hole in the side of his vessel. It simply wouldn't be possible to do these trades if it weren't for the business of insurance. That's why Lloyd's exists. That's why it's always existed. You can't run these enormous enterprises, whether it's a ship from one side of the world to the other, or building an oil terminal in Nigeria, or sending a satellite into space. You just can't do it without some comfort that you're going to make some money. And that's what Lloyd's does so well.
Okay. So with that in mind, I think we've set the table for what's about to happen. Okay. So let's do this. Let's take our break early. When we come back, we'll tell you about how the book starts out. It starts out with a man by the name of David Mockett, who has a huge role in this book. The name of the book is Dead in the Water, a true story of hijacking, murder, and a global maritime conspiracy. The authors are Matthew Campbell and Kit Chellel. They are our guests this evening here on True Crime Tuesday. When we come back, we'll tell you why David Mockett is so important to the story and what it is he finds out about this ship and the hijacking of this ship. And something is rotten in Denmark. We're not in Denmark, but something's definitely rotten about what happens when pirates decide they're going to take over the Brilliante Virtuoso. We'll find out what that is when we come back. And the best in true crime podcasting, this is True Crime Tuesday. Welcome back to the best in true crime podcasting. This is True Crime Tuesday. I'm Tim Dennis. Our guests are Matthew Campbell and Kit Chellel. The book is Dead in the Water, a true story of hijacking, murder, and a global maritime conspiracy. We have a link in the description of this program in which you can get yourself a copy of this book. And I'll tell you, folks, it is a fascinating read. There's a lot to learn here, and a very fascinating story in that there are a lot of twists and turns in this story. And it starts out with learning a little bit about a man by the name of David Mockett and his wife, Cynthia, who are key to the story. And Kit, tell us why David Mockett is key to this story.
Yeah, David Mockett is one of the big characters in the book. He was a marine surveyor, and so his job, he was part of the network of people who had stationed around the world who keep modern shipping running. His particular job was surveyor, so he inspects ships and their cargo. He's there to check that a vessel is carrying exactly the right number of steel bars, and have a look at the cargo, check it's not rusted or damaged. He's there if a ship has an incident and the propeller gets sheared off. He's the one who goes and has a look and gives a fair price of roughly what that might cost to fix. So these guys actually do play a sort of vital unsung role in how shipping works. And their jobs become most important when something goes wrong, when there's an accident, when there's a fire. You need a marine surveyor on the scene to tell you exactly what the damage is, because when you're talking about billion-dollar ships, the damage can be absolutely ruinous. Mm-hmm. So you need qualified professionals, and that's what he did. So he had built this life and career for himself in Yemen. Yemen is sort of at a strategically important point on the world map. Just as you exit the Suez Canal in Egypt, you have to pass Yemen and Somalia and make your way onto your destination, or stop there on your way in. So it's always been a very important place for shipping. It was once one of the world's great ports, Aden, sadly no longer. But because Yemen is such a chaotic, dangerous place, there aren't that many professional surveyors and mariners who work there. And David Mockett was one of the few. He was a former merchant mariner. He earned his captain's certificate. He'd spent his whole career working as a surveyor in places like Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. And he settled in Yemen because he was one of only a handful of people there who you would want to trust if you had a problem with your ship. So he made a very good living, and he settled himself in Aden, which is a historic sort of colonial British port city. And the book starts with an introduction to his life in Aden. His wife was out there visiting him, At that particular moment in time, Yemen was disintegrating into chaos and civil war. That sort of process of disintegration is still happening now. Hasn't really stopped. But back then in 2011, where we pick up the book, it was just starting. So there were gunfights in the street, there were massacres, armed Islamic terrorists were sort of patrolling the outer districts of Aden. It was a hugely dangerous time. But David Mockett still has a job to do. And there's a ship sort of sailing towards Aden, the Brilliante Virtuoso, which is the subject of our entire book, was on its way to him. And it would be this incredibly significant moment for him when he gets hired to investigate what happened. So
the ship is on its way at this point, correct? And there's a point where the ship in itself is attacked. But the attack isn't all that it is cracked up to be. We'll put it that way. There's supposed to be a security force that's supposed to come out to the ship to see it through kind of a sketchy area there in Yemen. It's known for what's the best way to put it here? Matthew, what's a good way of putting this area? It's political unrest, but also there's some issues with piracy. It's known to have its issues. It's known to have its issues. So they want additional. It's the owners, correct, of the ship that want to have additional security to make sure that the payload gets through this particular area and to its destination. Is that fair in saying?
That's right. So in the summer of 2011, which is when our book begins to unfold, the Gulf of Aden was the global capital of maritime piracy. There were constant attacks. And the shipping industry, through a lot of trial and error, had figured out that the best way to keep your vessel from getting successfully hijacked and held for ransom, potentially for years, was to put armed guards on board. And in fact, when armed guards were on board, or even in some cases unarmed guards, but just security professionals of some kind, vessels were almost never successfully hijacked when carrying one of these security teams. So in this case, the owners of the Brilliante Virtuoso had decided, or said they had decided in any case, to hire a team of unarmed guards who would accompany the vessel during the most dangerous part of its passage through the Gulf of Aden. So in July 2011, as David Mockett is in Aden going about his business as a maritime surveyor, the Brilliante comes into waters quite near that city in order to meet up with the security team who are on their way to go aboard. And as a result, it is drifting overnight, the night of July 5th, 2011. The engines are off, the sea is quiet, the crew are largely asleep in their cabins, awaiting this security team. And in that moment, some very momentous things indeed begin to happen.
Now, in itself, the crew has some issues. I'm trying to think of a good way to put this without spoiling too much of the book, but the crew has some issues in that there are some things that are done incorrectly. One, they wonder why the captain slows the boat as much as he does. But then the security force, and I'm using air quotes that nobody can see because, it's podcasting. The security force approaches the boat, not quite looking the way that a security force is supposed to. There was only supposed to be, was it 3 that were supposed to be in the security force? And there was a total of, I believe it was 7, correct? That came up. And the way they approached the one person that met them was not exactly the most friendly way and manner in which they were supposed to approach them. And as they were coming up to the ship, I forgot who gave the order. Was it the captain gave the order to put razor wire around the ship? Was that what it was?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's worth.
That had happened before.
Yeah, that was the build up. I think it's difficult to imagine what it's like to go through this process of transiting the Gulf of Aden, particularly at a time of piracy like this. You know, it was such a dangerous stretch of waterway that most ships preferred to go in convoy with a naval destroyer or some other naval vessel to accompany them. Like, that's how bad this was. Mm-hmm. We've all seen the film Captain Phillips with Tom Hanks. So you can picture what it looks like when a little boat pulls up alongside yours. They've got AK-47. Suddenly there's a grappling hook on the side. And suddenly, you know, your safe vessel, the place where you're working as a sailor, is crawling with armed Somalians. So it's, you know, it's a horrifying prospect. But as a sailor, as a captain, as a master, when you're passing through this area, there are things you're supposed to do to minimize that risk. So already the fact that the Brilliante Virtuoso is on its own is a problem for the people on board. You know, we have transcripts of the audio of sailors talking about how afraid they were of pirates, how worried they were that something bad was going to happen. And because of this order to pick up the security team, they were just floating in the middle of the night, lit up like a Christmas tree, visible for miles around. Like, you know, they might as well have painted a gigantic red target on the side of the vessel. And I think the people on board had a sense that this was not a particularly good idea. And so in the middle of the night, when you get a small skiff vessel, you know, approaching the Brilliante Virtuoso with its $100 million cargo, and the sailor on lookouts, all he can see is a bunch of men wearing masks and carrying AK-47 assault rifles and demanding to be given access, you can imagine how terrifying that would have been.
Correct. So the question begs to be asked here, Kit. Why not start out the voyage with security or armed men, knowing that you're going through a dangerous area?
It's a valid question. If you're going to serious about doing that, you would take on your armed men sooner in the voyage. They were already in a dangerous place when they stopped to pick up the security team. So the way it was done didn't make an enormous amount of sense.
Very true. So these pirates, and again, air quotes, you can't see them because it's podcasting, they board the ship. And from here, at least at this part of the book, it's a little sketchy as to how things happen, but this is the story as it happens. And you know what? Instead of me telling it, I'll have Matthew tell it. Matthew, essentially, at this point, the pirates, we'll call them pirates for lack of a better term, they board, they grab the crew, and from this point, what happens after they grab the crew?
So this group of pirates, as they turn out to be or appear to be, essentially talk their way on board the vessel, which is in itself very unusual. As Kit mentioned, you know, if you think of the great film Captain Phillips, the way pirates get on board is hooked ladders or grappling hooks and high-speed pursuits. The whole game, if you are the captain of a commercial vessel, is do not let these guys get on board, because once they're on board, they're armed, you're not, and you have a big problem. But in this case, very unusually, the pirates came alongside, claimed to be the security team that the Brilliante was waiting for. And despite the fact that there were more of them than were meant to be in the security team, the captain of the Brilliante gave the order to let them on board. As soon as they come on board, it becomes apparent this is no security team. In fact, these are bandits of some kind. They herd the crew into a few spaces, confining 24 of the 26 crew members in a sort of TV room lounge area where they can't get out. They then go with the captain in one direction, a few of the pirates, and then a few more go with the chief engineer in a different direction. And from the perspective of the bulk of the crew sitting in this windowless room, it's a very terrifying next couple of hours. As you can imagine, they hear gunfire at one point, and they are not allowed to leave. They can't even go to the bathroom. And then quite late in the evening, actually, in the early hours of July 6, 2011, there's a loud explosion and smoke starts pouring through the ventilation system into this TV room. And the sailors, these 24 Filipino seafarers who have been stuck in there for the last few hours, just think, the hell with this, we're getting out of here. And so they opened the door where there had been an armed man outside guarding them previously. That guard has taken off. They run up to the bridge trying to figure out what's happening. And they realize, first of all, their captain is up there. He's tied up. They free him and realize very quickly that there's a serious fire going on board the vessel, and a vessel that is, as we discussed earlier, carrying $100 million of oil. And actually, it is a slight... Oil tankers are actually not as flammable as they appear. The big risk is a spill. But that said, there are many places you would rather have a fire than on an oil tanker. You still don't want to be there under any circumstances if you can avoid it. So they begin to panic to some extent, and ultimately the captain gives the order to abandon ship.
Now, explain to me why they are not as flammable as you would think. Are there procedures on board that keep them from being as flammable, or are there mechanisms in place that keep them from being as flammable as they normally would be?
So the big reason is these vessels are not generally carrying gasoline. Okay. So crude oil doesn't burn very well on its own. Okay. In this case, this was fuel oil on the Brilliante, which I believe would burn somewhat more efficiently than crude oil. But in any case, firefighting and emergency procedures around firefighting are a huge part of your training as a sailor. There are very sophisticated fire suppression systems on all these vessels. There is an unlimited supply of water nearby, as you can imagine. Yep. So actually, something that came up much later and was queried by some of the insurers who were trying to delve deeper into this incident was why the crew, who had absolutely been trained in firefighting and had access to firefighting equipment, were not ordered by their captain to make greater efforts to stop this fire. The captain was rather quick to say, well, we're going to abandon ship, that's it. And that became one of a number of reasons why later on some of the professionals who investigated this incident concluded that it was not what it appeared to be. But for our purposes here, the important thing to know is that several hours after this pirate attack had begun, the apparent pirates seem to have disappeared. They're nowhere to be found. And the captain, a Filipino man named Noe Gonzaga, gives the order for everyone to abandon ship. They successfully make contact over the radio with a U.S. Navy cruiser, the Philippine Sea, which was in the area, which comes to their aid. And these 26 sailors are ultimately successfully rescued by the U.S. Navy.
So they send out the beacons, they get the radio signal, they get to the U.S. Navy cruiser. They're kind of swept up by them. They're taken, they're examined. They seem shocked, but they all pretty much collaborate the story. It's only the chief engineer that they had to go back and get, correct? Because he had cordoned himself off, and hadn't he done something to try to eliminate the fire? He had done something with wasn't it like an oxygen deprivation system or something? So
the chief engineer disappeared. So when the crew abandoned ship, 25 of them get into the lifeboats. They cannot find the 26th, which is the chief engineer. He had disappeared with two of the pirates very early on in this attack. He is ultimately spotted by a U.S. Navy helicopter on the deck of the Brilliante sometime after the rest of the crew have been successfully evacuated, waving a flashlight, trying to be rescued. It's not clear what he did in the time he was alone on board. And later on, again, that gap and the question of what he was up to while he was all alone on this burning ship, and whether potentially he had more complicated intentions than simply saving himself or trying to minimize the damage to the vessel, becomes very important. Okay. But the key thing is that he's on his own and no one knows what he was doing in that gap. There are some fairly persuasive theories as to what he may have been doing in that gap, however, which in the later trial that adjudicated all these issues became quite important.
Okay. So the crew is rescued, and it's at this point that David is called into the case by, is it the owner of the vessel, or he was called in by Lloyd's? Which one was it?
It was Lloyd's. It was the various insurance interests who were protecting the voyage and the vessel. So in a big, a major vessel and a major expedition like this, there'll be lots of different types of insurance and lots of different insurers, and all of them will have money at stake in the successful completion of the voyage. So David Mockett represented broadly the insurance industry that had money to lose if something went wrong.
Because at this point, Lloyd's doesn't believe that there's something not quite right in Denmark when it came to how this went off. It just doesn't, everything just doesn't quite fit. So they want to take a closer look at it. They're not saying that this wasn't a pirate attack, but it didn't quite look right.
Well, I think any time you've got $100 million worth of oil ablaze off the coast of Yemen, you're going to want someone to take a look, right? I mean,
right.
Even if they had no suspicions, you want a marine surveyor there to take a look. One of the big risks at that point, obviously, as Matt mentioned, is an oil spill. Now, that can end up costing a lot more than $100 million. If you spew out oil all over the coast of the Middle East, the cleanup costs of that run into billions. So you do whatever happens, you want a professional to come and take a look and see what the situation is. But you're right to say there were things about this piracy attack that didn't make sense. The first thing was just the fact that it happened in the middle of the night. That's just not what Somali pirates do or have ever done. Mm-hmm. You know, Somali pirates, it's actually quite difficult to get on board a moving tanker from a tiny little skiff. The deck will be 40 or 50 feet above you. Mm-hmm. The ship will be going full speed. It might be blasting you with water. It's not an easy thing to do. It's actually quite risky. So they don't tend to do it after dark. Most Somali piracy attacks happen in the daytime. And there was also the strangeness of, the pirates managed to get aboard the vessel. They take possession of this incredibly valuable prize, and then they just leave.
Yeah.
And there's a fire. Like it doesn't make financial sense. They didn't monetize their possession of the Brilliante Virtuoso in a very sensible way. They damaged it and left. They would have left with almost nothing. So anytime there's something unusual about an incident like this, the people with lots of money to lose start to ask questions, and that's exactly what happened here.
Now, there are some complications as David is trying to get out to the ship to investigate the ship. It isn't just, hopping onto a tug and getting out there, or hopping onto a ship to get out there. He has a few obstacles thrown his way. Kit, why don't you tell me a little bit about what's thrown in his way before he can get out there to actually start taking pictures and start investigating the ship?
Yeah, he didn't find it very easy to get out there. One reason for that is that they were, I think, 20 odd miles offshore, which is a day's sailing. And a significant journey just to take one guy out to take a look at a tanker. There's also the fact that it was Yemen, and it was a country on the brink of war. The port and the entire nation was in chaos. So it was quite difficult to find anyone willing to take him. He also had a problem in that he needed permission to go out. He needed to be invited, essentially, by the owners and the owner's representative. And that permission was quite slow to come. And already by this point, you've got a salvage crew who have appeared alongside the Brilliante Virtuoso. This is a little salvage tug, or a couple of vessels actually that have been sent from Aden, and they're there to basically extinguish the fire and try and rescue what they can from this vessel. And they're essentially at that moment they're in charge of it. It's their job to put out the fire and secure the safety of the ship. So he needs to ask their permission, and the Greek guy who's running the salvage operation doesn't seem very keen to have a surveyor come anywhere near the ship. He's obstructive. He tells them to stay away. He's kind of cantankerous and rude. But David Mockett is a professional. He's been doing this job a long time. He's used to overcoming challenges like this. He's persistent, and after several days nagging and repeated requests, he finally gets permission, and he's able quite quickly to charter a little fishing boat to take him out to the vessel and drop him off.
So he gets there to the Brilliante Virtuoso. He gets on the ship and he realizes that it wasn't just a couple of rocket launchers that had or grenades that had hit the ship that had started the fire. He's seeing a lot of melted slag. He's seeing some major damage on this ship. Something that's really not what it seems. He's not seeing bullet holes, which you would normally see from a Somali pirate gang. You know, a lot of them are armed with AK-47s. He's not seeing bullet holes anywhere on the ship. He's not seeing what would look like a typical pirate attack. And he's documenting this. He's taking pictures. He's writing things down. But he's not really saying much, is he? He's not telling this so much to the salvage crew that's there.
Well, so David Mockett goes on board the Brilliante, this burned out oil tanker. It's just had a huge fire. He can see very clearly that something really calamitous has happened. The vessel's a wreck, essentially. It's still floating and the oil is intact, but the crew spaces have been totally burned out. The fire melted steel everywhere. The bridge looks like a bomb hit it. It's just unbelievable devastation. But as you alluded to, David Mockett doesn't see things that are consistent with the story he was told. So at this point, the apparent cause of the fire was thought to have been a rocket-propelled grenade strike. Pirates do use RPGs. It does happen. And so that would be an explanation for why the ship would have been lit on fire, because there's no reason to light a ship on fire. It's not something you would do if you're a pirate. You want to protect that value, not destroy it.
Okay.
But David Mockett doesn't see any evidence of that. And he begins to get not suspicious. I think suspicious is probably too strong. But he begins to wonder if the story, and ultimately to conclude that the story was not what it seemed.
So he goes back to his office. He conducts his business. He's kicking around a theory. Meanwhile, he's got other friends that are coming into town. He's entertaining them. There are other people who are appearing in the picture. And tell me a little bit about the other people appearing in the picture at this time who are also involved in the investigation.
So when a big vessel gets into trouble, particularly very serious trouble, as this oil tanker did, there's a whole universe of people who swing into action. There are lawyers, there are marine surveyors like David Mockett, there are salvage crews, there are private investigators in some cases where things get more complicated. So in this case, Yemen and Aden in particular were very unstable. But you could still fly in and out. It was still possible for experts to come from London or from Greece, as they did in this case, to do a few days of work and then get out, although everyone would have been very nervous. So a surveyor representing the owner of the Brilliante also comes to Aden and actually is with David Mockett during his inspection. There's also a lawyer from London whose job is to take statements from the crew to create a record of everything that has happened and then use that as the basis for processing this huge insurance claim that has to move through the Lloyd's machinery. So there are a few people around. And then beyond that, there is this very eccentric crew of other expatriates in Aden, mostly Brits, mostly men who have hung on through some very unstable periods in Yemen, who are very comfortable there, who believe they have nothing to worry about. And in many cases, and David was certainly one of these, thought that there was no need to be concerned about the instability that everyone could see was really getting out of control. This was partway into the Arab Spring. The government of Yemen was in a state of unbelievable turmoil. And in retrospect, we now know it was the beginnings of the Yemeni civil war, which continues today. But David and many of the other expats who were in Aden at the time didn't think that the situation was that terrible, and certainly didn't think they had to leave.
Tell me a little bit about Roy Facey and his role in everything, and what was the difference between David Mockett and his attitude of I don't need to leave, and Facey's view of, well, maybe it is time to leave when it came to Yemen. So
Roy Facey was a longtime friend of David's. He was a real old timer in Yemen. He'd been there since the late 80s, on and off, and working in various maritime related jobs. Very engaging, very friendly guy with lots of local and expatriate friends. And Roy, like David, thought he had a pretty good handle on the risks, and both in a general sense of not being afraid that he would run into a riot that would get out of hand or anything like that. And also in a specific sense of thinking that if there were ever a threat to him personally, one of his Yemeni friends would tell him about it and he could get out of town before it became a big problem. So like David, he was someone who was totally comfortable in this very harsh, very foreign environment, a place where many of us would probably struggle to have a comfortable life. These guys, and there were a few more of them, were totally at home. And ultimately, they almost all left, although there are still a few who are hanging around, who have stuck it out through these years of incredible turmoil of the Yemeni civil war. But in the weeks after the Brilliante Virtuoso incident, quite a number of them did leave for reasons I'm sure we'll get into in a few minutes. Yep.
So David's given plenty of notice that, things are getting hot in Yemeni. There's really, it might be time for you to kind of, I think the term is hot frog. Is that what it was? That it's time for you maybe to get out because of, as you mentioned, the coming Yemeni civil war, that there's much instability there. David felt like he could handle things himself. He felt like he knew the landscape. He knew where to go, when to go. That no, I know how things operate here, and I'm in the middle of this investigation. I feel like I can handle myself. And he kept insisting to his wife, Cynthia, that he knew the lay of the land and things would be okay. Now, Cynthia, let's talk a little bit about her, had been to visit David on, at least I know one occasion that it points out in the book. Talk a little bit about Cynthia's worry as to whether he would be okay. Do you feel like she had a proper perspective that David was in danger at all?
I think she had a clear sense that this was not a good time to be in Yemen. During their last visit, she'd seen a sort of street riot descend into gunfire outside the window of the house that David was living in. Every night, the air was thick with the smell of burning tires. They could hear artillery in the hills. Cynthia was an experienced traveler. She'd spent a lifetime following David around to these places, and I think even she was worried. The official advice from the British embassy at that moment was get out of Yemen. It's not safe for you anymore. And actually, only a couple of weeks earlier, I think a Westerner had been murdered in a different location in Yemen. But David was the kind of personality he didn't tend to take advice very well. He felt that he knew the situation on the ground better than anyone. He felt comfortable enough to dismiss the advice from the British government that he should leave. He said, it's not that bad. If there's a riot, I'll take a different route home. I've been here a long time. Why would anyone be interested in me? And of course, he also had, he was the breadwinner for the family. This was his job. It was his job to be in Yemen doing this work. And he was a bit reluctant to give up his income just because people were sort of freaking out about the increasing violence in Yemen. So Cynthia didn't want him to be in Yemen. David felt that he was fine to be there, but he promised to come home. He said, I'm going to, after a short period of time, I'm going to come back to England. We're going to have summer in England and I'll be able to relax.
So you've got an investigation that's looking a little bit fishy. There's cause to believe that things aren't as they seem with the ship, with the Brilliante Virtuoso. You've got an increasing political climate that's becoming more and more dangerous. And there's this dangerous mix that's going on with David Mockett, where things are coming to a head on two different sides. Describe to us what happens next, Matthew, with David Mockett in that fateful night with him.
So David, after having visited the Brilliante, conducted his physical survey, begins to circulate his findings. He's sending them to London, where in turn they are being sent on to the broad community of people who are now interested in what happens to this vessel. Remember, this is a giant oil tanker carrying $100 million of oil. This is a very large liability and a very big problem for some very important and financially powerful interests. So there's a whole world of people who are keeping an eye on this situation and who are waiting for information from David and others on what has happened and what's going to happen next. So he's sending these comments, these summaries of his findings back to London, including statements to the effect that he has not found evidence of the story as it was told to him, that he's trying to substantiate the accounts of this pirate attack as they had come out in the immediate aftermath, and is having trouble doing so. And he also relays that some of the Yemeni authorities are very suspicious about this incident and are beginning to think that there could be something more going on here than just a garden variety pirate attack. So David is continuing to work, continuing to relay these observations back to London. And then on the 20th of July, 2011, it's a normal work day for him. He goes into the office in the morning as normal. He had a somewhat unusual, somewhat enviable schedule, actually, where he would work in the morning, then go home for lunch, rest in the afternoon, and then work again in the evening. And he gets into his car, which is a silver Lexus SUV, turns the key, pulls out of the driveway of his office building where he'd been going to work for years and is totally comfortable. And just as he comes onto the main road just outside, his car explodes. And there was a bomb under the driver's seat, targeted very clearly at him, clearly intended to kill him and no one else. And remarkably, no one else was even injured, despite this happening in the middle of the day. And initially, the blame, both by the Yemeni government and others, and broad media reporting, is on terrorism. Totally plausible, just on the face of it, that Al-Qaeda or one of the other jihadi groups who were active in Yemen at the time could have decided to take out a Westerner. And that is, at first, what everyone is convinced has happened. And only later did some of the people involved in this case begin to wonder if something else had in fact occurred.
Which is strange that they go straight to terrorism and to the political climate, and they don't directly go to the case that he's investigating, having to do with the ship and anything having to do with corruption in the shipping industry. What's interesting, and Kit, maybe you want to address this, is there's the reaction when we come back to Cynthia. Talk to me a little bit about the reaction that Cynthia has when the police come to the door and to talk to her, because it's almost like talking to a wife who's been involved with a soldier for so many years. It seems like, David had been on the road for so many years. They'd been separated. They'd been apart for so many years, and that she really only got so much time with David over the years, and that there was this promise that, they were going to be together for the summer, and we only had to make it so far. And then I got him again, only to have it taken away.
Yeah, Cynthia is, in some ways, a typical mariner's wife. She spent much of her life at home with the kids while David does his job somewhere else. And they spent an enormous amount of time apart over the years. And, they were deeply fond of each other still. They spoke on the phone every week. They emailed constantly. They were a very happy couple in many ways. But I think she felt that she'd been denied time with her husband, who she cared so much about. for most of her life, and that she was due some time with him. They were talking about his retirement. He was coming towards the end of his career. He wanted to see his grandchildren more. He wanted to be at home in England with her more. So she was kind of just holding on, waiting for a chance to see more of him. And then, of course, this incredibly tragic event happens. And, I spoke to Cynthia. I now know her pretty well. I think what's notable about her reaction was how astonished she was. She just didn't see it coming. I mean, we've talked about how dangerous Yemen was. But when the police pulled into her driveway, the first thing she thought was, they've got the wrong address. They're lost. And then a policeman walks up and she answers the door. And the guy delivers the bad news. And it's like Cynthia just went into a state of shock, as anyone would. It's not news that's easy to process. It's hard to even comprehend what's happening to you in that particular moment. And of course, she's absolutely devastated. And naturally, her mind turns to her daughters and the grandchildren and how she's going to deal with that. This horrible tragedy just, appears in their lives, and Cynthia's at the center of it, and it's her job to deal with it. She's absolutely devastated.
It seems like she doesn't get a lot of time to mourn for herself. It's almost like from the time of being told by the policeman to the time of, I have to really figure out what happened to my husband. The time of mourning's very short. And it's almost like she has to go into, for lack of a better term, like a warrior mode. She has to get into this and help solve this as well. Is that fair to say?
Well, I think she has to go into a mode where she has duties and responsibilities to other members of the family. She has to stay strong. She has to look after their daughters who are incredibly upset, traumatized by what's happened. She's their mother still. Mm-hmm. So she displays this remarkable toughness where the demands on her are enormous. She has to deal with the police. She has to deal with making arrangements for the body to come back to the UK. Everyone who encounters her at this time is stunned by how brave she is. I guess she doesn't really get much time to digest what's happening to the family. And it's not till sometime later that she starts to really think about her husband's death and what was behind it.
Matthew, tell us who Richard Veal is and how he fits into our story.
So Richard Veal is a private investigator in London. He's a former Metropolitan Police detective who joined the force right out of high school, really, and became initially a bobby on the beat in Westminster in London, in a precinct that includes the Houses of Parliament, Westminster Abbey, all the great landmarks. He ultimately becomes a detective looking into very serious investigations, but then decides in the late 80s that he's going to leave the police and try his hand in the private sector. So he builds a business called EBIS, European Business Information Services, that specializes over time in really complex investigations for private sector clients, particularly involving flows of money. And especially when those flows of money can be unraveled using the then newfangled technology of the internet, of which Richard was a very early adopter. And as you can imagine, a lot of London cops, being an old school bunch, were not. So that was how he got a leg up on a lot of these things. And he becomes extremely successful. And gradually he gets a bit of a following in the shipping industry. He starts doing assignments for either shipping companies, shipping insurers, because shipping is such an opaque world. It's totally built on shell companies, offshore jurisdictions, anonymous ownership, that actually, if your job is to unravel these very complicated financial knots and to figure out, for example, who really owns an asset, or who's really at the other end of some payment, shipping is a very good place to be in that business. So Richard begins to accumulate shipping clients to get a bit of a reputation as someone who can be called on for tough shipping assignments. And he also begins to look into piracy, because piracy was a mounting problem. There was a lot of money at stake in pirate attacks, and therefore a lot of money to be made helping the shipping world, and particularly the Lloyd's insurance market, stop it. So that's how Richard comes to this case. He is hired because he's someone who's known to have a good understanding of how the financial side of shipping works. So he is hired not long after the Brilliante Virtuoso attack by the insurers who were on the hook for the vessel to try and figure out what happened. And he gets to work.
There's a character that keeps coming out throughout the book, and I don't want to spoil the ending here, but talk about is he the salvager, the Vergos? Tell me a little bit about him, because he plays throughout the book without giving away too much towards the end. But David Mockett has an interesting let's just say, what's a good way to put it? He has an interesting encounter with him as he goes to investigate the first time. It starts out about as cordial as it can be, but tell me a little bit, if you would. Let's start with Kit. Tell me a little bit about his background and why he was somewhat cordial to David, and how the worm turns a little bit.
We're talking about Vasilios Vergos.
Yes.
Who is he's a Greek sailor. His role in the Brilliante Virtuoso was he was the salvage master. Mm-hmm. So he was the captain who was instructed by the owner of the ship to go and save it from the fire. And the way salvage works is, if you run a salvage business, you'll have ships in whichever part of the world you operate in. And when a ship gets into trouble, you rush to the scene. You're a bit like an emergency service, and you offer to help. And if they accept your help, that's kind of like a contract for a salvage expert, because if you successfully put out the fire or stop the vessel sinking, you're legally entitled then, under the rules of Lloyd's, to a portion of the value of whatever's inside the ship. And that can be an awful lot of money. If we're talking, $800 million in cargo, if you get 5-10% of that, as a salvor, that's an enormous sum of money. But it's a very risky business. You're doing some of the most dangerous work imaginable. These guys literally will board a sinking ship and try and stop it sinking. They have to work in abysmal conditions. If the weather's bad, they will board a burning vessel and try and find a way to extinguish the fire. So it's high risk, high reward stuff, and it attracts a certain kind of gnarled, tough sailor. Often these guys are at the hard edge of what they do. Vasilios Vergos served in the Greek Navy for a while. He was part of an elite team of divers who operated within the Greek Navy, and was an amazing swimmer, just an astonishing ability to swim. But he had an accident one day where he got a very bad case of the bends, I think it was, Matt, and it left him with a pronounced limp and a bad temper. So he's this leathery old Greek guy with a limp and a salvage business inexplicably in the middle of Yemen, one of the most dangerous places in the Middle East. And of course, because he's one of the few salvage businesses nearby, he's first on the scene. When David Mockett arrives at the vessel, he sleeps on Vergos's barge, where him and all the other salvors sleep. This rusting thing with a bunch of cabins below deck, and they all have dinner together. They have this strange dinner where you've got the English guy talking to the Greek guys and a bunch of Bangladeshi crewmen in the background, and they have this strange encounter. And of course, Mockett is there. He's got a job to do. He's a professional, so he can't be totally forthcoming. The salvage master is there really on behalf of the owner of the vessel and its insurers, and he's got a job to do. But they sit down, they have this cordial dinner, and they talk about their grandchildren. They talk about their lives and their jobs. And Vergos makes this pointed comment to David Mockett, which though the words that he uttered became important much later, which is how we know about them. But he said to David Mockett, Yemen's a dangerous place. You shouldn't be here. You should be at home with your grandchildren. You should stay with your grandchildren, which is a sort of, can be taken as a polite way of saying, this isn't the place for you. And we don't really know what David made of that. It was a very strange encounter they had.
Very, very. There's also another statement that's made when Cynthia's taken out to dinner after the funeral for David, in which I believe it was a representative of Lloyd's told her about the incident having to do with the Brilliante Virtuoso. It's not the first time that something like this has happened. Isn't it something like that, to paraphrase?
Yeah, it's. I think this isn't the first time. This has happened before, were the words. And that's because Vasilios Virgos is either very lucky or very unlucky, depending on how you look at it. An incident like this has happened only a few years earlier, very close to where the Brilliante is now floating. Another Greek-owned vessel gets into trouble on a sandbank, catches fire. Virgos and his crew go out to do the salvage job, and that vessel ends up being completely destroyed, splits in half a few miles away up the coast. And that incident became kind of notorious at Lloyd's because, giant steel oil tankers don't just split open like a watermelon. Obviously, there's some sort of pressure has been brought to bear on the vessel for that to happen. It was claimed to be an accident, but the circumstances were so strange that a lot of people at Lloyd's knew about it. And so when, of course, another Greek-owned vessel gets into trouble in almost the exact same spot a couple of years later, and it's the exact same salvage master who rushes to the scene, people in Lloyd's get to talking. And so the man from Lloyd's sits down with Cynthia, and he tells her that there's something odd's going on here. This has happened before. Not only is it Virgos again, the same salvage master, but the chief engineer of the Brilliante Virtuoso was also working as the chief engineer of the other Greek-owned vessel that got in trouble on the sandbank. So it's a series of coincidences that definitely merit a bit of attention from everyone involved.
That indeed. Yeah. At that point, guys, I think we need to let the audience kind of stew on that and get the book, don't we? I think that's a good place to kind of let people...
Absolutely.
Let people kind of... I think we've piqued their curiosity enough. Folks, I got to tell you, this was an amazing book, and one of those books that you just can't put down once you start reading. Name of the book is Dead in the Water, A True Story of Hijacking, Murder, and a Global Maritime Conspiracy. Our guests have been Matthew Campbell and Kit Chellel. Matthew and Kit, I want to thank you very much for being with us today on True Crime Tuesday. It's been my pleasure.
Thanks so much, Tim.
All right, it's a time where if you're listening to the free version of the show, we must bid you adieu. But if you don't want to leave us right now, you don't necessarily have to. What you can do is you can go to Stitcher.com, click on the subscribe button under Stitcher Premium. That will get you to listen to Dumb Crime Stupid Criminals. That'll get you to listen to the ad-free version of Darkness Radio. And that'll get you to listen to hundreds of podcasts ad-free and expand your audio horizons more than you could possibly ever imagine. And the best thing is you can do it for just $5 a month. Do it right now. Go to Stitcher.com, click on that premium button, subscribe to Stitcher Premium for just $5 a month. You'll get Dumb Crime Stupid Criminals as far as True Crime Tuesday. You'll get an ad-free Darkness Radio. And of course, you'll get hundreds of podcasts ad-free and expand those audio horizons. Go ahead and do it today.